MS-13. You know about MS-13? It's not pleasant for them anymore, folks. It's not pleasant for them anymore. Get them the hell out of here, right? Get them out.
All of us today witnessed the Biden cages. What is occurring here on the border is heartbreaking, and it is a tragedy.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Instead of asking a Republican or a Democrat, why don't you ask the people in charge of policing the border what the problem is? Rather than making a political statement and a question, why don't you walk right over there and ask the guy, what the hell happened?
So we get it, Republican politicians. We're supposed to be afraid of what's happening south of the border. And of course, it's a crisis created by Joe Biden, and Americans need to be afraid, just the way that we were in the midterm back in 2018, where we were hearing every single day about caravans of people that were coming and the threats and the violence that's going to enter America until the day of the election, and then no one heard about it again until Joe Biden became president. Now, I know I'm setting this up to be really cynical, but I am, because as a former Republican here in the state of Arizona, where I was a very proud liberal basher and somebody who wanted a strong America and was very much into that frame of mind. A trend that started to emerge in the early 2000s, which has now very much here in 2021 come back to be one of the most important narratives for the current version of the Republican Party, is the crisis at the border, which of course is being blamed on the current president that's there. But the one thing that, as a former history teacher and as somebody who has traveled south of the border and know not just to the tourist destinations in Mexico, but to a very eye-opening experience in Central America, one of the questions I want everybody who sees this to ask themselves is, why? Why are people coming to this country, to America, and not necessarily doing it through the normal channels of getting a passport and traveling and doing those things? Why would people come? And to those that say they just want people to come legally, okay, amnesty is legal. Coming here and saying I'm fleeing violence and I'm looking for safety and I'm trying to get here, that is absolutely legal. You cannot deny that. And if you are denying that, there's something in you that isn't caring about legality. There's something else. And while we could spend an entire degree program and more talking about all of the things that are happening south of the border from the United States that are driving immigrants to come to this country, in this video, I'm simply going to focus on one that I had a personal experience with, and it was the most eye-opening experience of my life. This video is going to focus on the history of a country called El Salvador. El Salvador, for the past 40 years, has been one of the most violent countries in the world. The violence itself cannot be separated from United States policy. There's no way. Because so many things that the United States has done has dramatically increased the amount of violence in that country. Now look, I'm not laying it all on the United States. There's certainly some problems that are there that are Salvadoran problems. But what I'm going to talk about here is how America caused some chaos in that country. We have to own it. And as somebody who, again, used to wear the conservative label very proudly, and when I would talk about proposed policies, I would make sure that we wanted personal accountability. We don't want to enable people to have behaviors that are essentially poor, and we're going to have policy that's going to reinforce the fact that they're not taking responsibility for their own actions. I want to apply that in foreign policy now to just one, and there are many because there's been 50 plus military interventions that the United States has done south of the United States border, not just Mexico, and I know that some politicians pretend it's just Mexico, but we're going to look at what happened in El Salvador and use that as an example for why things are not so simple when it comes to immigration, and why simply demonizing people that are trying to find a better life is completely abandoning the principles that I find as a proud American as part of the culture and the fabric of the country that I'm proud to live in. So why El Salvador? How the heck did I get to go to one of the most violent countries in the world? I'll tell you, it was back as I was completing my undergraduate degree. In 2004, I received a phone call out of the blue from a cousin of mine. This cousin of mine had two simple questions for me. First, he said, "What do you know about the country of El Salvador?" And I said, being a student that was getting ready to be a social studies teacher in high school, I'd studied a little about it, and all I could say is, I know it's in Central America, and I know it had something to do with the Cold War, and I'm out. That's all I know. Question number 2. Want to go? Okay, I'm down. I'm up for an adventure. And in that moment of being kind of naive and flippant, I did not realize what kind of a journey I was going to take and how this was going to change my perspective of everything. So let's take it from the top. In the way that this organization from Arizona State University helped me get there was that before we got on the plane, they gave us the brief history of El Salvador so that we knew what we were walking into and understood a little something before we would get there. And then what I'm going to do after I give you the history lesson that I was given is I'm going to give you the walk through El Salvador through my eyes and what we saw and what we experienced, and try to reflect that back to the current narrative in 2021 about immigration. And again, El Salvador is one example of what is happening south of the U.S. border. But I think you're going to see how this dramatically impacts immigration, and how if we're not talking about these sorts of aspects about immigration, we're not having an honest debate. And if we're not having an honest debate, then the next question is, why? So with that, here's the brief history that I'm going to go through. Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador. Tiny country in Central America that is no bigger than New Hampshire. And yet, during the 1980s, part of the U.S. foreign policy under Ronald Reagan involved sending $1 million a day to this small little country. Prior to any United States involvement in El Salvador, there was already a movement, a civil rights movement that was taking place there because of some of the atrocities that were taking place with the government. Now, the government that had been left following Spanish influence was a group that was essentially a mestizo government, meaning a mixture of native and Spanish blood that was there. And they had accumulated a lot of wealth among them. Basically, 5 families ran the entire country and made up the entire government. Now, these 5 families considered themselves superior by having the wealth and being mestizo, and the native culture that was there, again, that didn't have this mestizo heritage and also was predominantly Catholic, they just were ostracized by the government that was there, and slowly but surely, they started committing crimes and taking out people that they felt were a threat to the government, trying to hold down this group that they considered inferior to who that they were. And a voice emerged from that group in El Salvador that was being oppressed. And that gentleman was named Oscar Romero. He was the Archbishop in the Roman Catholic Church down there. And if you find history books that have the history of El Salvador, they're going to talk about a philosophy that he made famous at the time called liberation theology. His idea was simple, that most people around the world, you don't have to be Catholic to adhere to this theology. It's if you are a part of a peaceful religion and you want the negativity and the violence in your life in the countries that you are being a part of to go away, live your faith. And that will make things better. It's a simple philosophy in theory. In practice, obviously not so simple. But the thing about Oscar Romero was he was so influential throughout El Salvador that he could convince soldiers in the militia that were under the control of that mestizo government, he could convince them to disobey orders by articulating his philosophy of live your faith and don't do things that God would not want you to do. Now, to any government, when somebody is there that can convince soldiers to disobey orders, you automatically know they're a threat. And you can probably see where this is going to lead and ultimately escalate. Now, before anything happened to Romero, he also used underground radio networks that were built up in El Salvador, calling up to the United States up north and saying, help us. You know, you have these principles that are freedom of religion. You shouldn't be persecuted for your faith. You know, this is something that is championed by the United States. Please help us in this fight against this government that are committing these atrocities against us. And a phrase came out at the time from the Reagan administration, which was, and this may sound familiar to anybody listening in 2021 or after, America first. We have problems here. We need to take care of our own. I'm sorry, we can't help you. Now, here's the thing. The problems in El Salvador weren't going away. The atrocities, the murders, the things that were taking place were going to continue. And in fact, the most high profile of those murders was Romero himself, who was literally in a mass with a congregation in front of him when an assassin pulled up outside the church in a car, the rifle came out, and he was professionally assassinated in front of his congregation. That escalated into what became a civil war in that country. And what really kickstarted it wasn't just the assassination of Romero, but days later, the National Cathedral in that country, where his funeral was taking place, the government realized really quick that they killed this man who was so influential to the people of El Salvador, and they martyred him. So many people descended on the National Cathedral to remember him, and the government realized quickly that they may have made him more powerful in death than he ever was in life. So, of course, they could not let that stand. So as people were mourning, and as the body of Romero was there, the military showed up, and they opened fire on the crowd. Many people were murdered. Others got inside the National Cathedral with the body of Romero, and they had to live there for days before eventually they were allowed to create a tomb for him. And in the time that we went, it was interesting that we got to go visit the tomb of Romero, but local people in El Salvador are still to this day not allowed to. They don't want people to know what happened. They don't want people to know the history because of what took place. Now again, for these people it survived, and not only was it survival of just making it through the gunfire and all of that, they're still being persecuted for their faith. And they were looking for help, and they're not going to turn it down from anybody. And this is where the world gets complicated. The United States chose not to help them. There was a call. We said no. This group is still being murdered. And of course, one major influence throughout that time period in Central and South America was Fidel Castro. Castro was more than happy to take advantage of the situation, said, I'll help you. Now, if you are the people of El Salvador that are, again, dealing with these atrocities, are you going to say no because of his politics? No. But to America, who had lived under this doctrine called the Truman Doctrine ever since the Cold War began, from an ignorant view, these people were now fighting for communism. And as people I met in El Salvador would attest to, they couldn't spell communism. They could have cared less about communism. They were trying to fight back against the government. They were going to take aid from anybody who was willing to help them, and the United States wasn't. So next man up, and that man was Fidel. Now, not only is this going back to the Truman Doctrine, again, American policy impacting people around the world, you had the Monroe Doctrine back in the day that said America is going to be the country that shapes the Western Hemisphere. Europe, stay out. This is our domain. And shape it we have. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, 50 plus military engagements. And ultimately what takes place in El Salvador following this move is that the Reagan administration would draw a line in the sand metaphorically and say, this is where the Cold War is going to end. And so the government that is murdering people for their faith, that is going after members of the Catholic Church, is now getting $1 million a day from the United States government, fighting against a group that is now taking military assistance and aid from Fidel Castro. And what you had was the last proxy war of the Cold War. Now, if we're being honest, this mural that you're seeing here is really what said it all. This is what the people of El Salvador essentially felt like. As you can see, the people behind Romero all holding their hands up as if they had been crucified. Because to them, this is what it was about. It wasn't about communism. It was about them being persecuted for their faith. And on the right, as you can see, the politicians, the people from the Catholic Church that were outside of the country with almost demonic faces, turning their backs and not looking at what is happening. And to this day, as we have an immigration debate in America, and El Salvador is one of the places many people are still fleeing, we still are doing what you are seeing on the right side of that mural, where we are closing our eyes, closing our ears, and not seeing what happened, and especially the United States' responsibility. So what responsibility am I talking about? Well, the group that was taking aid from Castro is a group that became known as the FMLN, Farabundo Martí Liberación Nacional. And yes, it may be simplistic to say they were fighting for communism. But as you can see here, as the government was being armed and equipped with Vietnam-era military weaponry and training from the United States, what was really happening is it was a persecution by faith. This is a church that was bombed out, that was in an area. It became commonplace for these types of atrocities to take place. We went to one of those underground radio networks to be able to see what it was like and how Romero would get the message out. And of course, there's this huge bomb crater that was at one of it. And we got the lesson about the weapons of that era, that not only were designed to be able to explode and have very large, damage based on that, but also the fact that they were designed to break apart in very jagged pieces of metal called shrapnel, so that if the explosion didn't get you, the flying pieces of metal might. What can shrapnel look like? Here you go. And of course, this U.S. Soviet-backed brutality goes on for 10 years, where atrocities take place, where things like Agent Orange that were so commonly talked about from Vietnam, defoliants that cause all sorts of medical problems, took place in the country. There's still ecological damage that's there. Again, people dealing with this that are obviously in a country that don't have things like healthcare and, doctors to go to. And that was the history lesson that we got. So after learning all of that, in March of 2005, the group that I was with got on a plane, flew down to El Salvador. For the purpose of brevity in this video, I'll tell you this. We headed out on a road which made me appreciate roads in the United States because it was not put together very well. It made me appreciate emission standards because cars there were pumping all sorts of garbage out. I don't get motion sick easy, but I did on the windy, twisty roads there with all the smog and emissions that were coming from the vehicles there. And we eventually get to this little town of Guarjila. Late at night, we can't see anything. There's no street lights really in the area, so we have no idea where we are. All I know is that we slept in a glorified chicken coop for the night. And by the way, chicken is what we heard all night because they run feral in that area. And little did we know that not only would they keep us up all night, our first night in El Salvador, we literally woke up the next morning, looked up, and saw little tiny feet hung up along a big bar and the necks getting cut of the chickens. And we were explained that's lunch. Welcome to Guarjila. Now, we came here for a reason. I mean, there's a great organization and some great, wonderful people that we met there, but really it was the history of Guarjila that brought us there and ultimately the people that lived it. This group that I mentioned, the FMLN, that again was taking things from Castro, not fighting for communism, just fighting for their right to believe what they want in the Roman Catholic faith that they had. This was one of many towns where people had organized and were able to do it. And two people that were there that were a part of this FMLN organization, one, as you can see here, is named Maria Chichircon, and the other is John Giuliano. Now, quickly on John. John was not born in El Salvador. He was actually born in the Bronx. He was a professional hockey player at the time the Civil War was going on, but because he was such a devout man of faith, he illegally crossed the border the other way, worked his way down to El Salvador to pick up arms to fight for his faith. Not too many people I've encountered in life that would be willing to do something like that. But John, that's him. And in his dealings down there, he met Maria here, who the quotes on Chichiricon there were because there's an area in the mountain near Guarjila nicknamed Chichiricon, which is where if the death squads from the government would come through in the military, alarm would go off, people would, get everybody's attention, and they would lead them up this path to get up into the mountains. Before they had to flee the military that would come through Guarjila, they were there recruiting and trying to help get people as a part of this movement to fight back against the government. What would those recruits look like? Well, as you can see, they were young, and we would meet numerous people who were among those recruits. I'll give you some of their stories in a bit. But again, before this trip, if you were to tell me there were a group of people that would be, recruiting preteens, they didn't have combat boots, they had flip-flops, and they would be fighting against a group trained and equipped by the United States of America, I'd say they'd have no chance at winning. Yet, they fought that way for 10 years, and they did not lose. As mentioned, part of the way they survived was to run from when these death squads would come through, and they would get up into these very high areas in the Los Pinos Mountains, which is where Guarjila is located. And we took that same path that people would do, and we hiked what the locals affectionately referred to as the hill. That was flagrant false advertising, given the length of the duration and the difficulty of being able to get up this mountain, of which, at least for myself, I got very dehydrated on the way up. I was not feeling great by the time I sat down here at my sleeping bag. Shortly as the night, we were supposed to be laying down and going to sleep, I felt my stomach get upset. I lurched forward, puked my guts out, barely missing my friend Kyle that you can barely see in the image right there. And at that point, totally dehydrated, nothing in my stomach. I kind of felt like, there's nothing that can make it worse. But later that night, I remember feeling something that was, kind of around me or, bugging me. I thought it was, very large mosquitoes. Again, I'm out of it at this point. I don't know what is going on. And a friend of mine wakes up in the morning and goes, "Dude, that bat was all over you last night." It's a fun time. Other wildlife while we were there, we ate breakfast, just like the people back in the day that would be fleeing these military interventions would, cooking the tortillas right on the fire. Not much to eat, but it was wonderful the next morning. And then, of course, to relax after this, we were taken to a place called the Rio Sum Pool, where we got to, bathe in the waters and swim around and enjoy ourselves. After hearing some history and learning what happened and recovering from the hike and everything, if people were really daring, they could jump off the bridge that was about 25, 30 feet up into the water. My cousin Mike that lured me onto this trip is who you see falling there off the bridge. And of course, one of the more memorable moments of this day was him hitting the water butt cheek first, blowing his entire swimsuit out, and him coming up out of the water, slightly embarrassed, calling for me to be able to get him something to keep his dignity about himself. Of course, I started snapping pictures. Those will not make it in this video. But after we had our fun, we were all called in to the shore. And everywhere we went, different people from this Tamarindo foundation that we got to know down there would come with us. And in this case, it were the two people you see here on the left, Victoria and Louis. And this was the beginning of a pattern of where they would take us somewhere, let us have a really good time, and then tell us why they took us there. And in the case of the Rio Sum Pool, back when this civil war started with the funding from the United States and the things that were coming in from Castro, this very place we were at was the site of a terrible massacre. And it was Victoria there that started giving us the story of how the military in El Salvador became infamous for one of their tactics that they would do, which was they would take a lot of pregnant women, bring them to the shoreline, cut their stomachs open, and remove the unborn child, kill it so the mother could see, kill the mother, dump all of their bodies into the river, and let them float upstream. Now, why would anyone do that? Number one, that river was the main water supply for that entire region of El Salvador. And so if you wanted clean water, now you were forced to go to the government and swear allegiance or give information about what's going on to be able to do it. Number two, it's a very powerful message. We have the United States on our side. We can do whatever we want. Victoria didn't just tell us the story. She told us how she escaped it. and was there, as did Louis. We're really close to the Honduran border at this point, and as war tends to do, it doesn't respect borders. So as they are fleeing and running from these Salvadoran death squads, they're now getting shot at from Honduras because Honduras doesn't want the civil war in El Salvador to pour over the border. We heard story after story like this as we went. And Louis there, when this war was done, Louis was two things. Louis was a very hardened guerrilla war veteran that had fought against this group trained and equipped by the United States for years. And he was a 16-year-old kid at the end of the war. Louis first picked up a gun when he was 9. And while those stories are incredible, what is much more incredible is what John and Louis and Victoria and people did when the war was done, which was they created this Tamarindo Foundation, which became a place for, at first it was veterans that had fought in the Civil War to have a place to talk and work things out and play sports together, to do something constructive. And as time went on, it became a place for their children, which is what it is today. And even their children's children at this point. It's been going for so long. For them to have a place that doesn't involve the gangs. We'll get to gangs like MS-13 as we go through this. But gang violence is a very terrible problem to this day in El Salvador because the government isn't there to help people. They're there to help themselves. And so when people need security, they turn to gangs. And MS-13 is the most prevalent that has been obviously talked about by politicians, including former President Trump. But the Tamarindo Foundation gave them a place, and they were the group that helped take us around El Salvador. The following day, they would take us to a place called Chalatenango. Again, take us somewhere, let us have a good time. We went to some shops. We got to see some things in this little tiny city, and it was, enjoyable to see something that was very different. But of course, then they took us to the place to explain why they brought us here, which was to tell us the story of these nuns that had come from the United States. The nuns became known as the Maryknoll Sisters. They were from the United States, and again, knowing that people in this country were being persecuted for their faith, they left the United States, went down there a couple of different times to bring aid, to bring things, to try to help people out that were going through this horrific ordeal. And you can imagine the reaction in the media when they started covering the exploits of these nuns that were going to this country and, again, helping people that were fighting against those that were being supported by the United States government. And to put it into a modern context, if a Muslim group, went to the Middle East to support people that were dealing with, wars that the United States had been lodging in Yemen or other places, how would that be viewed? How would it look? And you can imagine how it was back then. Well, these nuns went down several times, being demonized in the press. But on their trip down there, the final trip, they were met at the airport, the military, followed, run off the road, beaten, raped, and murdered. And of course, we came to their final resting place to hear this story about this. And it should be noted that many people that would come from this organization at Arizona State were Catholic. And at one point, Catholics were not let in this country, and to this day are still persecuted there, at least if you are native citizens. They do not like attention from outsiders, but internally they still persecute those that are the faithful today. So again, when we're bringing this full circle to an amnesty situation here in the United States, they are looking for a place to practice their faith. They can't do that down there. The signs of this civil war are still there everywhere. Bullet holes in the wall, buildings that have been half blown away, and of course the emotional and the mental scars shared very openly by the people that we met there. It was difficult, obviously, to not only hear the stories, but to reflect on what does this mean as somebody who comes from the United States, is an American in this country, and how am I being viewed? And I'm pleasantly surprised to report that, we were viewed very positively because they just wanted people to know what happens, because as tends to be something globally, doesn't matter who you are, cultures don't like to acknowledge mistakes. When I had a student come into my classroom from Japan and I showed video of Pearl Harbor, he was floored. No clue. Never learned it. It's not hard to, find stories about the fact that in the Middle East, they don't print Israel in maps, and, other places around the world just don't like acknowledging things they've done wrong. There's a reason in the United States that when you get into the overall things that, by law, standards that you're supposed to teach, there's not a whole lot about Central and South America. There's a reason for that. Now, up to this point, we'd heard A lot of difficult stories. It's difficult to process. It was emotional to process. But we hadn't experienced anything like the city of El Mozote. The exploits of El Mozote have become infamous over the years. Like many places in El Salvador, Mozote was targeted by the government for extermination, and one day back in the early 1980s, the military would show up, would systematically pull everybody out of their home, and murder everybody in this town square. When we got there, 2005, buildings were still being rebuilt, and we walked over to this memorial, which is not just a memorial, but a mass grave. And in fact, shortly after we were there in 2005, another mass grave had been discovered, and that mass grave was of the children. And one thing that they asked us to do was to keep in mind what this plaque says, which they translated for us. It says, "They are not dead, they are with you, they are with us in humanity." Because this is where people that we met really wanted to hammer home the lessons about what was happening in El Salvador. One of the stories told to us about what took place there actually was published in a book called The Massacre at El Mozote. The author's named Mark Danner. Highly encourage the read. It's a very difficult read, but I highly encourage it because it documented what took place. Now, like I said, early in the 1980s, the military, just found this as another stronghold. People that were, considered inferior, that were Catholic, that were everything that the government hated and were looking to exterminate. And what happened here was that as people are being brought out of their homes, a story is going to emerge from this massacre that is going to be shared for years to come with the military in El Salvador. The story took place because of a little girl, and no one knows her name, no one will, but her example is what spread through the military ranks. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, what made Romero so dangerous to the government in El Salvador is his liberation theology. Live your faith. You want the bad things to go away? Live your faith. So as these soldiers were breaking into homes in El Mozote and pulling people out, and they knew they were going to their death, I think most of us would fight back. We'd be violent. We'd do something. But this young girl who, from all estimates, they assumed she was in her teens, she chose to live her faith. She did not punch. She did not throw anything. She sang a song about how great God is and about how great heaven will be. And angered that she would do this, she was beaten mercilessly by the soldiers there before they took her out to that town square. And she was raped. And throughout it all, she sang. Angered that she continued this, one of the military officers came over and shot her. And with the little voice she had left, and the little strength, she sang a song about how great God is and about how great heaven will be. Now, she died, but her example is what was shared among the military folks that first saw and witnessed that and then told others. And people would desert their ranks, scared at what they were doing, ashamed of what they were doing. And as for El Mozote, I would love to tell you there was a happy ending. But there's just no such thing from El Mozote. That young girl lost her life the way everybody else there lost her life, as they were shot and then their heads were removed with a machete. Now, the other story documented in Mark Danner's book, and the story that we were told by John, was about a woman named Rufina Amaya Marquez. Rufina was the sole survivor of the massacre at El Mozote. And as people were taken out, stripped naked, lined up in the town square to be shot, she was smart. They missed her, and she fell and acted as though she had been killed, and there was enough blood and carnage around that the soldiers did not notice. And as they were going and rounding up their next batch of victims, she crawled away. Crawled, naked, afraid, with everybody she knew and everybody she loved being murdered. And John, as you see here, walked us on her path. About 60 yards from the town square, she found a place that there's still the remnants of the home there that when 2005 as we were walking it, but it was obviously much more constructed at the time. And she thought as she got to this home behind a wall, maybe she'd be safe. But as she got closer, she could hear the screams coming out and realized that is where the children of El Mozote were being murdered. So she crawled on another 70 yards, down a hill, to the place that you see John standing at the post here, where he's reading her story to us. She hid there and listened to everybody get murdered in El Mozote. And as word spread from these soldiers that had been deserting ranks and others heard, the FMLN heard there may be a massacre at this place, and they showed up a couple of days later, and they found her terrified, naked, and afraid in the bushes here. And Rufina was taken out. She was given medical treatment. In fact, they got her out of the country via Cuba, because that's who the FMLN were getting support from. And Rufina, this simple woman from this tiny town most people have never heard of, was given an opportunity to travel to New York City and the United Nations and address the entire General Assembly of the UN to testify about what was happening in El Salvador and asking the world body to intervene and stop it. But with the United States being one of the major Security Council members, fighting against what they perceived at the time to be the expansion of communism, and of course China and Russia having no problem with communism possibly expanding, France and Britain on the Security Council not really wanting to be a part of it, the United States essentially led the message that said, hey, she's taking aid and support from Fidel Castro, you can't trust a dang word she says. I cannot imagine being her, living through that, testifying before the General Assembly of the UN and being ignored. But that is her story. Now, we went back to that mass grave. We sat there, we wrote messages, and I was very uncomfortable when they opened up this gate and had us standing literally on top of this mass grave. And we sat and discussed things like U.S. foreign policy, immigration policy. And the realization hit that these people that may be fleeing, and certainly did in the 1980s, to try to come to America, that are asking for amnesty, that are coming in some people's perception illegal, but again, amnesty is very legal. If people are thinking, they got to come the legal way by getting a passport or something to be able to leave, this government would never issue that to them. They would never be allowed to legally leave under that circumstance, and so their only option would be amnesty. And how dare we criticize them, given our role in what happened there? Now, as we were having these conversations, the rain started coming in, and, rains in El Salvador and the roads there, it can be very, very dangerous. So we had to finish up our conversation quick, and we got back into the van that was taking us around, but there was one place we had to go before we would leave Mozote. You see, Rufina moved back there. To meet somebody in her home that has experienced something like that, and after John told us her story, to listen to her tell it, was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. It's an experience I'll never forget, and one that made me really think about the role the United States plays in the world and the human cost of that. Those types of incidents would be commonplace in El Salvador for the entirety of the 1980s. So how does this thing come to an end? To talk about that, we have to fast forward to the year 1989 and go to a place known as the UCA, the University of Central America. See, by then, tens of thousands of Salvadorans had been killed, many by machine gun, many more by machete, and the carnage continued. And of course, the persecution of Catholics had continued. And an event took place here in 1989 where the 6 Jesuit priests that ran the UCA were targeted because, again, they were educating people, and the first thing regimes that are this terrible and autocratic want to do is stop education, because people who aren't educated and don't know are much more easily controlled. And so to try to make a point to people that education was not what they should do, and to try to take away some leadership at a very well-known educational institution, one morning in 1989, the military showed up to the barracks that these priests lived in, busted down the door, pulled the 6 priests out, and murdered them on this lawn in very cruel fashion. And the room that you see here, John pulls out books. And as he opens the books after telling us the story, we see the graphic images. And I mean very graphic images. One was a headless corpse with a brain by it. They literally shot this man's brain out, documented it to use it as an example about why people shouldn't get educated and stay away from this. And on that very lawn where this massacre took place, again, we sat down and discussed these very concepts of immigration, foreign policy, all of those things. Now, that event is what really changed it, because as the news media was covering it, the question became, well, why are these people being supported by the United States pulling priests out of their bed and murdering them in broad daylight? It's 1989. The wall is coming down. The Soviet Union is collapsing. It's no longer the threatening Cold War it once was. And so overnight, the United States just decided no more money. The United States would essentially broker what the U.S. called a peace. Essentially, the war just stopped because they didn't have money to fight it anymore. There's nothing else coming from Castro. There's nothing else coming from the United States. All of that violence led to almost no change in the way that things were. People just went back to try to live in their lives. And again, fast forward to 2021 to this day, some political changes have taken place. Government's still super corrupt. There's still not much wealth in the country. There's a lot of problems that are going on there. And there's, as you can imagine from all of the violence, a huge power vacuum that took place. So what happened with that power vacuum? Did the government have the power to do things? No. Remember, as I said, when the government doesn't have the ability to provide security, people turn to their own. That's why gang violence is so bad there these days. And in the middle of all of this taking place, in this power vacuum that is as a result of the war that we helped to fund, Bill Clinton's era, in trying to look tough on crime, started deporting lots of people out of the United States. And part of the groups that were being sent back involved this gang called MS-13 that did not start in El Salvador. Started in the United States, started in California.
We will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace, as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. We are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws.
Nobody's waiting for you in the airport. Where do you go? Where do you live?
These gangsters went back to El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and they created mayhem in these countries.
And that is what has then formed these same brand name gangs in these other countries.
During the 80s, as the people were fleeing and coming to the U.S. and looking for a different life, many found themselves in poor neighborhoods in Los Angeles, which, of course, throughout that time period, there were incredibly difficult situations with the police departments and the way that the minorities were being policed at that time, which, again, much of that exists up to this day throughout the United States. But to help each other, they turned to this formation of a gang, and MS-13 became the most violent of the Salvadoran gangs. They gained a reputation in California as being this, trying to look tough on crime. Bill Clinton deported them back to El Salvador, and they take over. In fact, some of the neighborhoods we drove through were MS-13 neighborhoods. We were warned, do not go past certain areas and streets and all of that. And of course, we don't understand, what that means, but I think the understanding came from when we were driving through one of these MS-13 neighborhoods, and the van that we were traveling with blew a tire. I have never seen a tire change faster in my life. The people that we were there with got that done, and we were out because you could see the fear in their face. And again, it's a very real phenomenon. The violence that has taken place there is a thing that everybody has to deal with. And the lessons of what this meant to us were something that we had to reflect on quite a bit during this. Our last night in El Salvador, we were on this island out in the Pacific, and this was the sunset that we had that was there. And It's the backdrop to where we discussed all the lessons we were taking away from El Salvador. And so to wrap up this video, I'll start it with the same backdrop that we had, but I'll give you the first and most major lessons, which is money and happiness. You know, the people that we met there had next to nothing. The homes, barely any electricity. There were 2 refrigerators in the entire town of Guarjila, first place that we were at. There's no indoor plumbing. The outdoor outhouses that we had to use had bowls that separated urine from feces because as people who produce their own crops, they don't go to Home Depot and buy manure to be able to make the crops. They are self-producing that, and that is why the bowls are the way that they are. We didn't have running water to brush our teeth or to take showers. We would jump into lakes. We would use these oversized sinks called pilas that the women there would go to these wells and bring water back. We had to keep the pila clean. We couldn't let anything get in it because that's their drinking water and everything that they had. And if you were to tell me prior to this trip that people living in that circumstance could be living and be very happy, I don't know if I would have agreed with you, and yet they were. And for the people that we encountered, like Louis, like John, like Maria, like Victoria, like Rufina, that experienced the atrocities of that war, they told us over and over again that what they are to this day sad about and why they try to be so happy in their lives is because it took all of that to appreciate what they had. And for the group that I went with, a bunch of spoiled Americans, it was a real reality check. The next lesson is geopolitical. World conflict is not so simple. As I said, the group there reached out to the United States. The U.S. said no. We abdicated any chance of helping and be on the side of righteousness down there. And as a result, they turned to Castro. And in places we went, there was a restaurant we went where there was this AK up on the wall with an FMLN, insignia that was on it. They really took pride in being able to fight for themselves. But it turned into this really difficult, awful situation that it never should have been. So can the U.S. get involved in everything? No. Of course we can't. No country should do that, get involved in everybody else's affairs. But as the United States, as the country that helped shape the world the way that it is, as a sitting member on the UN Security Council, that appointed ourselves one of the major influencers in the world, when we choose not to do something, we can't get angry when these people turn to others. All right, look, let's talk immigration. And let's not do it with nameless, faceless terms like so many people do, like illegals and other things like that. Let's put some real faces to it. The kid that I have my arm around there is named Lino. Lino's father, at the time, was in the United States illegally. I didn't at the time know where Lino's father was. Lino didn't know where his father was. And the odds of Lino ever seeing his father again were slim to none. So why was his father here illegally? Well, because school existed in El Salvador, but it was $300 a month. For people that live in a town like Guarjila, it might as well be $1 million. They don't have $300 a month. And what parent does not want a better future for their child? At the time, I wasn't a parent. Now I am. I know how much I want my children to have life be better than what I had. Lino's father put himself into a modern-day slave trade with a person called a coyote, somebody that smuggles them into the United States illegally. And part of the fee for doing that is they get a job, they have to pay back the coyote, they have to send money back home, which is why they came in the first place. And if they miss payments, then, something bad might happen to them. But Lino's father, like many people in El Salvador, were willing to do that to try to give his child an opportunity at a better future. And given the atrocities that they survived and lived through there, who could blame him? Because his father lived through the war that I just described. As mentioned previously, could Lino's father have come here the legal way? He's not going to get a passport. He's not going to be given something to travel to the United States that way. He couldn't afford a plane flight. If he showed up and claimed amnesty, even in the 80s, it was very difficult to get in throughout the 90s. We have a very complicated immigration process by design, mind you, because politicians politicize it. And it isn't about helping people. It certainly isn't about the conservative value of personal responsibility and making sure we support those that were done wrong by us. It's about politics. Now, Louis over here is holding his beautiful daughter at the time. We talked to Louis about his opportunities, and the thing was, Louis was doing it right. in El Salvador. He gained a mechanical knowledge during the war to fix engines and do things like that that actually allowed him to have a job, which is a rarity in a place that was there. But shortly after we left, a hurricane came through and it wiped out the shop that he worked at, and there's no finding another job or rebuilding. Mother Nature took over and he's left in positions, and so he, at the time we talked to him, and there was shame in his face that he had even contemplated leaving his daughter behind to come to the United States to give them an opportunity to have a better future, to send money back. And thankfully, the Tamarindo Foundation, run by John, gives him a job in El Salvador through the donations of people mostly from the United States. And that has kept him there to be part of his family. But that's not the norm for Salvadorans. How should we as Americans judge that when they come here, given our influence on what happened there? So to hear messages like this coming from our current politicians in 2021...
It's not just in America that knows it's a crisis outside of the White House. Even the president of Mexico. He said that people coming to the border see Biden as the migrant president, the encouragement of making it happen. I couldn't agree more. That is why we must address this crisis at the border. It is spiraling out of control and is entirely caused by the actions of this administration.
Imagine if you're president and you have, these are Trump's cages overflowing with kids in the middle of a pandemic that, with a high positivity of COVID, I would argue if it was a daycare center, you'd be shut down and charged with child abuse.
And it's a horrible situation, could destroy our country. People are pouring in, but you'll see something as the months go by like you've never seen before. Already it's like you've never seen before. There's never been anything like what's happened at our border. And people are coming in by the tens of thousands. They're walking in. We were setting record positive numbers, and people would have to come in legally. And the other thing that people don't talk about, human trafficking and drugs. That's doubled, tripled, and quadrupled coming in because that's pouring in right now. Drugs are pouring in. We had it so tight. We were doing so well. We had it down to a number that nobody could believe. One other thing, they're sending us not their best people. They're sending us people that in many cases, not in all cases, are murderers, drug dealers, human traffickers, really bad rapists, really bad people. They're sending us people from their prisons. Those people are coming into our country.
It's infuriating. Absolutely infuriating for somebody like me who had this experience. And this is one country. There are so many more examples of things that have happened south of the United States that the United States involved themselves in, destabilizing governments, doing all sorts of things and there's a reason our children don't see those in the history books in high schools. I'd encourage anybody seeing this to study the history, to be open to that, to look at the history involving, Contras, Sandinistas, the FMLN, other groups that have been down there, Allende, Pinochet. So many times the United States got involved. And yet, so-called conservatives, who again have always placed emphasis on personal responsibility, don't recognize that and instead say this.
The number of new illegal immigrant families who have crossed the border so far this year already exceeds the entire total from 2015. They are being released by the tens of thousands into our communities with no regard for the impact on public safety or resources.
Can we please stop the ignorance? Please?